Welcome to this presentation on Keats's Odes, subtitled The Visionary Struggle and the Reconciliation of the Ideal and the Real. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on the issues of structure. That'll help you to understand what Keats is trying to do in these odes. In general, the odes deal with a problem. The problem is mutability or impermanence. This is a classic human problem and a classic theme in all art and poetry dating back to the Greeks and on even through the present day. Mutability, impermanence obviously mean that things change. And humans generally don't like change. We like things to stay the same. We want things to always be the way they are. We want the people we love to always be around. We don't want them to leave. We don't want them to die. We don't want our relationships to end. We don't want our children to grow up, etc., etc., etc. But they do. And so with Keats, who was always living with the specter of death over his head, and of course he did die at a very young age, but for him, of course, the problem of mutability, the problem of impermanence, was an existential problem. And so this is what he devotes his odes to examining. And he proposes a solution, and that is that one can transcend the earthly limitations by means of the visionary imagination. In other words, one can transcend the real, which is the realm in which things fall apart and pass away, by accessing the ideal, that realm that philosophers and artists have identified as being forever new, forever permanent. And so this is what he's doing in the odes. However, as he proceeds in the odes, he comes to recognize a problem. And the problem, of course, is that this hypothetical solution of the transcendent power of the visionary imagination does not really solve the actual problem. As the odes proceed, we see Keats wrestling with the problem until we get to the last two, especially to autumn, in which we see Keats rejecting the visionary imagination as a false lore, inadequate to the needs of the problem, in favor of the naturalized imagination, not the visionary imagination, embracing as his own and man's chief good. In other words, what Keats is wrestling with is wanting to transcend the real by accessing the ideal through the visionary imagination. What he comes to realize is that those two the problem of the two can only be resolved if you can bring them together. And so what he winds up doing is recognizing within the real the glimpses of the ideal that can bring him consolation and resolve this problem of impermanence. In other words, to go back to Wordsworth, nature provides these permanent forms, and even though there is change, we can still experience permanence within impermanence. I'm going to talk a little bit about the romantic lyric structure. We talked about it as the romantic visionary lyric structure when we talked about Wordsworth, and a little bit too when we talked about the Ancient Mariner. Here I'm referring to it as the romantic lyric dialectic, because the idea of the dialectic, which is the reconciliation, the ultimate reconciliation of what's known as a thesis and an antithesis, of two apparently oppositional terms or oppositional ideas or situations being reconciled into a third. That's what we will see eventually happening. But with the romantic lyric, and again, I wish we had more time. We could have looked at Shelley's lyrics, which also follow this structure here, is that there is a boundary separating the ideal from the real. That is represented by X. The ideal is the concepts that we associate with the ideal are heaven, immortality, eternity, spirituality, and the unknown. Whereas terms that we associate with the real are earth, mortality, the fact that we're going to die, time, right, as opposed to eternity, we live according to the clock, materiality, as opposed to spirituality, the material world, and known, the things that are right in front of our faces. The journey of the romantic lyric generally is moving from point A, in which the speaker begins in the ideal, the poem begins in the real, and then moves to point B, where the speaker visits the ideal through what's called mental flight, but we'll call it the imagination as well. And then a return to the real, because the speaker, and here are the reasons why, because something is lacking in the imagined ideal, or the speaker discovers that he doesn't belong or cannot permanently belong to the ideal. So the speaker has to return to the real. However, the speaker has acquired a better understanding of a situation or a change in attitude towards it from the experience. In other words, he is a different person or has returned from the ideal with a different perspective or a different mindset, represented by A prime. Until we get to the end, each one of these odes is going to be going to employ in one fashion or another this particular structure. But what's interesting is that the odes overall also engage in this structure. Now, there's a slight variation. That is that with Ode to Psyche, we actually begin in the ideal realm. It is obviously the most ideal. The ideal of, or it participates in the ideal more so than any of the other odes. It is a rejection of the real for the ideal. So, as we'll see, it inverts this A, B, A prime, or A1 structure, and it is the mythological ideal in his praise to this belated god of the Roman pantheon, Psyche. Then we move on to Ode to a Nightingale, which is the beginning of his really questioning the viability of this structure, this flight into the ideal, and then a return to the real. And then with Ode on a Grecian Urn, we move closer to reality, and it is the one poem that does follow most purely this A, B, A1, or A prime structure. And then we'll get to the last two poems, Ode on Melancholy and then to Autumn, which is an ode but not called an ode. We do return to and stay generally in the realm of reality. With Ode on Melancholy, we return to reality. It's a rejection of ideal as a form of escapism from suffering, and it exhibits the realization that sorrow intensifies joy and joy intensifies sorrow. The ideal and the real must coexist, though apparently separately, according to the poem. But by the time we get to Autumn, the return is complete, and the ideal, which is the spring, flowers, birth, is inherent in the real, represented by autumn, the falling leaves, and death, through the season's beauty, and specifically references to fruit, the maturing sun, the cider, the singing creatures of the season. So spring is often used as a symbol, again, for birth, new life, for all of the positive things that we think about in life, and autumn, of course, old age and death. And yet, autumn is the season whereby the seeds are released. Where, in other words, autumn is the season where things come to fruition. So, as things are dying, they're giving forth their fruit. So, there is a kind of fulfillment in autumn. And so, the poem, I think, fairly beautifully reconciles both life and death, all of these opposites that that Keats is playing with throughout the Odes. And as you can see, the overall trajectory of the Odes leads us from the ideal down to the A1 of the real. Okay, let's take a look at Ode to Psyche. And I said that Keats creates variations on that overall romantic lyric structure that we just looked at, and this is a fine example. In Ode to Psyche, he actually inverts it. So he begins in the ideal, moves down to the real, and then returns to the ideal again. But the return to the ideal is marked by a problem, which we'll get to in a second. So if you were to look over the poem, in stanza 1, we have this very lush description of the ideal, the experience of the gods pausing from lovemaking in nature. It is a representation of ideal love, of ideal union, both physical union, but also human and nature, or I guess God and nature, and an ideal setting. But in the second stanza, the reality of Psyche's plight, as the description from the textbook explains, comes to the fore with the repetition of the word no repeatedly, a negation of this ideal vision that we saw in stanza 1. The reality of Psyche's situation is not that she is engaged in this lovemaking with Cupid, but rather that in the historical reality, she was added to the Roman pantheon at the end of the Roman Empire, so there were no temples that were built to her, that she was not actively worshipped in the way that the other gods had been for centuries. And so, and above and beyond that, the very culture that worshipped her and that worshipped the pantheon, the group of gods of which she was a part, is dead. And so it is the ultimate no. There is no way that Psyche will get her due as a goddess unless somebody with imagination can do this for her. And that's in fact what in stanza 3 we see happening with Keats. He recognizes at the beginning of the stanza the real situation, the sense of belatedness or loss, the ironic but brief recognition that even the gods, who are immortal and therefore ideal, die, and their deaths and life depend on human worshippers or mortals. So he is really examining the real psychology of worship, certainly within the context of Roman and classical cultures' worship of pagan gods. So what does he do? Well, and you can see that, of course, is below the line that divides the real and the ideal. In the second part of the stanza, he says that he will become her worshipper, and he will fulfill the potential that reality failed to realize that reality failed to do, and he will do this through the imagination, through inspired eyes, as he writes. And then in stanza 4, Keats returns to the state of the ideal. Keats says he will be the priest, that his poems will be her rites, her rituals, his mind, where the imagination lies, his psyche, that's the Greek word for mind, and his imagination will be the place of worship. That's where he's going to build the temple. However, there is a problem. If you notice in the stanza, the stars are without name. There is nothing distinct. There is no reality in the ideal at the end. So Keats ends Ode to Psyche in an ideal realm, but the ideal realm is vague because it's not real, so it doesn't have distinction. This is a problem that Keats is acknowledging in the poem. We move on now to the most complex of all the odes, and that is Ode on a Nightingale. And this one almost completely follows the structure. Notice again we're back to the A, B, A1 or A prime structure, where the poet begins in reality, transports himself into the realm of the ideal, and then returns to reality. However, it's not completely this the overall structure that we talked about in the structure on the romantic lyric. He begins with sections 1 through 3 with the expression of the desire to escape from reality, because reality is full of sorrow and despairs. In other words, mutability. Right? Things change. We saw this in the Ode to Psyche, where there is a lamentation of both historic change and, of historic change, of belatedness. Psyche is denied something that Keats believes she deserved because of changes to the historical landscape. So here, of course, we're dealing with something more personal. The nightingale is a symbol of the ideal, and this is not uncommon. Birds, because they fly, poets often use them as symbols of something like the ideal. Because they sing, they are often seen as symbols too of the poet himself or herself. So, the poet, as Keats points out, the nightingale does not know what Keats knows and what's causing him to be sad, which is the groans, the world weariness. The sorrows of reality are unknown to the nightingale. Now in sections 4 through 6, we have this moment of imaginative transcendence, where Keats transcends reality through the poetic enactment of the nightingale's flight. He creates a situation in the poem where both he and the nightingale become one. They are both singers of ideal songs, the nightingale's musical song, of course, and Keats' musical words, and they become unified in the ideal realm through this imaginative transformation. But when we get to section 7, we begin the come down, where Keats acknowledges that the birds' immortal song acknowledgement that the birds' immortal song stirs thoughts of forlorn lands, time and mortality, the end, the life that comes to an end, that terminates, re-enter the poem. So we're moving away from this immortal, eternal, spiritual realm back into the realm of time, of mortality, of materiality, of earth as opposed to heaven, in this case the skies. And when we get to section 8, Keats has come down completely. There is a complete separation and a return to the reality. The speaker succumbs to the limitations of both poetry and himself. He sees himself as a limited self, and this is also part of the problem of being in the real realm. But unlike what most lyric visionary poems in the Romantic period do, where the poet comes back with some kind of special knowledge that makes reality more livable, he comes back with a question: do I wake or sleep? So there is again a question of the purpose of imagination. And now we move on to Ode on a Grecian Urn, which is the one poem that, depending on how you interpret the end, is the most traditional of all of these odes in relation to this structure that we looked at, that we're looking at, the ABA prime structure. We begin with Keats addressing the urn in the first section as both a real object and as an ideal object. It is an object in a museum. It's something that you can physically touch, so it partakes of reality. And yet it is a work of art, and it bears artistic depictions. And so when we deal with the artistic situation here, we're moving into the ideal realm. In section 2, we have a transition from reality to the ideal. The real are the unheard melodies, because we can't hear them. The melodies that these people are depicted as playing, again, like we saw with Ode to Psyche, they're gone. That culture that produced those melodies no longer exists, and they didn't write those melodies down. Those melodies are gone. The unheard melodies, however, are the ideal, the ones that exist in the imagination. And so the main theme here becomes stated. The ideal is eternal. The lover's love is eternal, but without consummation. So now we're beginning to look at the problem of the ideal. Okay, not just that you can't live there, but the question of, do you want to live there? What sacrifices would have to be made to live in the realm of the ideal? And he's telling this. By the time we get to section 3, he is addressing this specifically. There is a complete transcendence, right? We're in completely the realm of the ideal. Nothing will ever die, right? It is eternal. It is immortal. There is only ever and more. Note the repetition of those words. And note their counterpoint to the negations of never and not in section 2. So we have now full consummation of the ideal. But the real problem here is that, as Keats points out, in order to remain forever young, forever beautiful, forever in love, you have to sacrifice the consummation of love. The young man will never catch the young woman. So they might remain in this eternal state of love and bliss, but the bliss will never reach its final human climax, because of course we are talking about sex here. So by the time we get to section 4, we're really looking at the negative consequences of immortality and the ideal. Art cannot answer existential questions. This is a key moment in the course of all of the odes. They can only evoke the long dead people who created it and could answer them. In other words, we see depictions of the ancient Greeks, and yet the questions about the lives of the Greeks who created the work of art are gone. They cannot be answered. They remain forever outside of the realm of knowledge, and knowledge will be important at the end here. And so in section 5 we return to the real, and the speaker addresses the urn as an art object, the ideal in the real. Of course, the highly quoted conclusion is ambiguous. As art, the object can, well, you know what? I'm not going to say much about this, because that's what you're going to be writing about in your forms. So let's just say that what the work of art does say something to us. What it says to us and what is said to it is something that you're going to have to determine. And finally we come to the last 2 poems, last 2 odes, in which the problem is resolved through a synthesis. And this is going to come up next week, so let me address this. The thesis, what I'm talking about here, is something called a dialectic. You have a thesis, I mentioned this earlier, and an antithesis, what appear to be opposites. And in dialectical thinking, the two, through engagement with each other, produce what's called a synthesis, a combination that incorporates, depending on the type of dialectic you're engaged in, that it produces some kind of unification of the elements of both the thesis and the antithesis. This is going to be, like I said, very important when we look at the intellectual background of the Victorian period next week. In the first poem, Ode on Melancholy, and I'm not going to go into specific details, these are very rich, lush poems that I can't pick through without destroying in many respects. You're going to have to be on your own, but I can give you some guidance here. In Ode on Melancholy, Keats finally rejects this escape from reality through death or through art. Okay, and the reality of the thesis in this poem, of course, is that reality is a poison. He introduces this in the very beginning. It's sorrow, it's death, there's anger, and death again. The antithesis, of course, is the ideal, but in this case, the ideal as an antidote. There is always going to be sorrow, there's always going to be death, there's always going to be anger, but there is also beauty, there's joy, there's pleasure, there are immortal things like art or certain states of emotion or being. And these two must coexist with each other. You can't escape from one into the other, right? Neither the ideal means nothing if you don't have the real to latch onto, like we saw in Ode on the Grecian Urn. However, the real is nothing but sorrow, death, and anger, and these negatives, without the ideal to elevate it to something more meaningful. So he says that he admits that the ideal gives meaning to the real, and the real gives intensity to the ideal. In other words, things are more beautiful because we see them in light of or in contrast with the sorrowful. Right? Joy is more intense because there is the end of joy. Pleasure is more intense because there is the end of pleasure. So the fact that things end makes them much more, in these beautiful, wonderful things end, makes the experience of them much more intense. But by the time we get to autumn, we now have a synthesis. He's not keeping the thesis and antithesis together but separated. Rather, he brings them both together in the person or in the figure of autumn. Autumn is the season of death, but it's also the season of fructification, right? In other words, as everything apparently dies, of course, goes dormant, but as things die, they also fulfill themselves. They produce the seeds that will allow for regeneration. They produce the fruits that are the focal point of their lives. So an apple tree in autumn produces apples. And so even though it's dying, quote unquote, it's producing life. And it is in this synthesis that that Keats finally reconciles the problem he's been dealing with. Again, I would love to spend an entire week with all of you in a classroom situation discussing this, talking about it, having you contradict my interpretations, discussing why we differ, really enjoying the pleasure of reading these poems. I'm afraid that we won't have that opportunity, not in this online class. But I really hope that you spend some time with these and let them work upon you. That's the only thing that I hope for. I can't force you to do that. I will just assume that you have allowed yourself to be open to this most beautiful way of addressing some of the most profound and urgent questions that we face as humans.